Welcome to Our Weird World. I'm your host, John Henson, and today is the final episode of the fourth year. Technically, here's the thing. It's season 4 finale, but it just bothers me. All right, because here's the thing. I had originally planned to start this podcast the first week of January 2020. And then in unstereotypical fashion of me, I just kind of sat on it and waited. And then the pandemic happened and I was like, what better time than now to just launch this thing. And so I did, but now that means that the season finale and then the next season premiere is in the middle of March. And that bothers me. It means nothing to literally no one else. And honestly, I don't even have to point this out. I could just keep going. I don't even have to, I could just do episode 208 and then I could do episode 209 next week and just keep going as if nothing changed. And here's the thing, nothing actually did change, but it did, because this is the last week of the fourth year of doing this show. And holy crap, it's crazy how things have changed, right? Because episode 1, we were doing this in a time where weren't allowed to go out in public for the most part, right? Tons of people lost their jobs. There's a global pandemic and things were weird. And I was having the time of my life, because there's nothing I enjoy more than not going outside. Unless there's a waterfall involved. I'll go out if there's a waterfall or wings. Pretty much anything else, though, it's kind of a drag, kind of a bummer. But I was thriving. I was thriving during the pandemic. I was doing this show. I was working from home. I was the happiest I had ever been. And I still don't think I've eclipsed that yet. All right. And that's crazy, because in that same amount of time, I've gotten married, and now there is a tiny baby sitting at my feet while I record this. And that's wild. In 4 years, that's like a whole time of college. And now that I say that out loud, a lot changes in 4 years. I get that. But just a blue-eyed reminder looking me in the face. Well, he's not looking at me right now. He's looking at the ceiling fan, because he loves ceiling fans. Anyway, what are we talking about today? You don't care about any of this. Today, we are wrapping up season 4, year 4 of the show, talking about politics. So we got 4 stories here from the lesser rosy side of politics, as if there's a good side of it. You never hear about any good politics. Maybe once a quarter, some politician actually does something beneficial, but the rest of the time, it is not the case. All right. They're always outraged over something. They're always trying to take people's rights away. They're always trying to do some sort of corrupt, shady stuff. And here's the thing. A lot of what you see, 99% of what you see from the political world is driven by the media, because the media just wants the ratings. There is a lot of time where people in Congress or your state legislator are actually working together. They actually get along very well. There's always a couple of nutties, little nut jobs here and there causing trouble. All right. But for the most part, people are actually professional and they actually do things. But guess what? Doing nice things and doing things that improve everyone's life isn't sexy. People are going to tune in to hear about that good news. All right. They want to hear the salacious bits. They want to see people getting ousted and impeached and all of that. And the media is driving that. And that's why politics suck. And it's why if you're one of those people who genuinely enjoys politics, you're weird. All right. That should be autism right there. Not what I have. All right. Not me being just a naturally curious, detail-oriented, hypervigilant person. No, some dork who likes to read bills and follow, percentage points and approval ratings and caucuses and primaries, all that's boring. That's autism. But no, I'm the one with the disability. It's not right. Finn agrees. Finn's like, yeah, Dad, that's weird how you got a disability, but then there's people who like politics. Anyway, he seems very unsure of all of this. So we're going to jump in to story time. 4 stories today. We're looking at the Congressional Brawl, the Battle of Athens, Jack Fellure, and Kisimba Ngoy. Here we go. My goal with this episode, as with the last few that I've recorded, is to try to get him to fall asleep at some point during the stories. And if there was ever a set of stories that's going to put a baby to sleep, it's going to be stories about politics. So we're starting with Preston Brooks, who was born on August 5th, 1819 in Roseland, South Carolina. Although he grew up to attend the University of South Carolina, he was expelled just before he graduated after he threatened to shoot at local police officers. Somehow, despite all of this, Brooks still got into law school, received admission into the South Carolina bar, and then opened a law firm in the town of Edgefield, which was kind of like close to Roseland where he grew up. In 1840, he found himself in a duel with a guy named Louis T. Wigfall, who was a future senator from Texas. And in this duel, Brooks was actually shot in the hip, and the resulting injury from that forced him to use a cane for the rest of his life. Now, at some point along the way, Brooks then went on to marry Caroline Means, but she and their only child, Whitfield, died in 1843. The following year, Brooks was elected to the South Carolina State House of Representatives and began his political career despite having threatened to shoot police officers. This is a different time, right? I think you get like some crusty Black Lives Matter dude trying to run for Congress, and then it's revealed during his campaign that he threatened to shoot police officers. No one's voting for this guy. Maybe in Seattle, but like anywhere else, no, he's not making it. But Preston Brooks from South Carolina, he's the man. He then served while he was the state rep for South Carolina. He actually then served in the Mexican-American War before marrying Martha Means, who was probably very closely related to his first wife, Caroline Means. I couldn't verify that with sources, but it's probably true. And then ended up having 3 children with her. In 1853, Brooks moved up and joined Congress, where he, like most Southern Democrats at the time, I know, but we got to do this. I can tell you're not a fan of politics, but we got to do the story. That was very rude of you to interrupt. He's actually kind of jazzed about this story. Anyway, it's a good story. I'll give him credit. You're going to like this one. Anyway, 1853, Preston Brooks joins Congress, and like most Southern Democrats at the time, took a very strong pro-slavery stance, and even going so far as to say that enslaving Black people was the right and proper thing to do, and that any restriction on the institution of slavery was in turn an attack on the social structure in the South. And to think that there are people in this world still today who believe that the Civil War had nothing to do with slavery is baffling, when you have these politicians who are just like, yeah, slavery's right. Keeping Black people chained up, it's right. And if you take slavery away, you're going to mess with the entire social hierarchy of the South. We will rise again, and we're going to do so on the backs of our Black slaves. It's okay, buddy. They're not going to stay slaves. See, that's what's cool about history. You get the spoilers, right? But you don't know any of this yet because you're only a few months old, right? Anyway, I keep losing my spot. This is how season 4 should end. Just the biggest train wreck of an unorganized show I can possibly put together. Anyway, none of Brooks's political stance and statements were surprising, considering he already owned a plantation back in South Carolina. And 3 years later, in 1856, Congress had become heavily divided over what to do about the Kansas territory, namely whether to admit the territory into the Union as a free state or as a slave state. Brooks obviously supported the pro-slavery attacks in the territory that later came to be known as Bleeding Kansas, and prophesied that the decision on how to admit Kansas would ultimately decide the fate of slavery in the South. And it kind of did, because obviously the Civil War would happen a few years later. Well, on May 20th, 1856, Massachusetts Republican Senator Charles Sumner delivered his, quote, "Crime Against Kansas" speech, which argued for the admission of Kansas as a free state. Sumner ridiculed the authors of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which was Stephen Douglas from Illinois and Andrew Butler from South Carolina, who also happened to be Preston Brooks' cousin. Sumner even made fun of Butler's speech impediment that he had developed after having recently suffered a stroke. So, kind of not cool, all right? Dude from Massachusetts, he's up there. It's like, yeah, these dudes from the South. I don't know what accent that is. They suck. They talk funny because the Boston accent's not the dumbest sounding accent in the world by far. And he's making fun of it. And so Brooks, he's mad about this, not just because Sumner disagrees with his political philosophies, but because he's making fun of his cousin. Brooks initially wanted to challenge Sumner to a duel because politicians used to resolve disputes by murdering each other. But considering that he was at least 0-1 in his dueling career up to that point, Brooks instead asked fellow South Carolina Representative Lawrence Keitt for some tips on how to properly duel. And in response, Keitt kind of told him that dueling was something reserved for only noble and dignified individuals, of which Charles Sumner was not. Do not waste your time, boy, on dueling this Yankee from Massachusetts. Dueling is a noble act. It's only reserved for the highest individuals of society, of which Charles Sumner is nothing but Southie trash. This kid is not enjoying this story. He doesn't enjoy the accents. Too bad. We're going to keep going. Sumner, according to Keitt, was nothing more than a drunkard who used coarse language and deserved to be beaten senseless. And so that's what Brooks did. Brooks took his advice literally. 2 days after Sumner had given his Crime Against Kansas speech, Brooks walked into the Senate chamber with Keitt and Henry Edmondson, another Democratic representative from Virginia, with plans to take this dude out. The men waited for a few minutes for the gallery to clear. They made sure that no women were present because they were still going to be chivalrous like that. And then when the gallery was nearly empty, they saw Senator Sumner still sitting at his desk. And Brooks, probably not believing his good fortune, walked up to him. And he walks up to Preston Brooks he walks up to Sumner, Preston Brooks does. And he says, "Mr. Sumner, I have read your speech twice over carefully. It is a libel on South Carolina and Mr. Butler, who is a relative of mine." And then Sumner, he tries to stand up from his desk. And at that point, Brooks took that as a threat and started wailing on him with his cane. The first blow caused Sumner to lose his sight. And then even worse, after falling back down, Sumner became pinned beneath his desk as Brooks continued to just beat him with his cane. Finally, Sumner was able to unpry himself out of his desk. I know. It's so dramatic right now. We're at the crescendo of the story. He rises up out of his desk. And still blind, he can't see, rips the desks from its bolts on the floor and throws them at Sumner to try to get away. He then stumbled up the aisle toward the exit. And all this time, Brooks is just continuing to just smack this dude with his cane. Other senators in the room quickly saw the fight and they tried to intervene. But then Lawrence Keitt, he's right there. He takes his pistol out and he starts pointing it at everybody. He says, "Let the men do their duels and fight their fights. I shoot everyone in this here Senate chamber." I don't know if that's what he said, but it's kind of what he was saying. Eventually, Representatives Ambrose Murray and Edwin Morgan, both from New York, were able to break up the fight. Brooks fled the chamber because he knew he had done a bad thing, but he was later arrested. By then, by the end of this fight, his cane had been snapped into several pieces, and the floor was soaked in Sumner's blood. While both men recovered from the fight, Brooks had actually suffered injuries of his own. He had at one point accidentally hit himself with his own backswing and cut himself open. Sumner, he's beaten all to hell in this. While they're recovering, the rest of Congress actually started arguing over who was right and wrong in this fight, as if there was any argument to be made that this wasn't somehow Brooks's fault. He made this, it was premeditated. Sumner just literally stood up from his desk and he got beaten up for it. Southern congressmen made rings actually out of Brooks's broken cane and actually wore them around their necks in solidarity. Anson Burlingame, a member of the American Party from Massachusetts, also made a scathing speech denouncing Brooks's action. When Brooks found out about this speech, he challenged Burlingame to a duel because, of course he would. He hasn't learned his lesson yet. Burlingame actually really happily accepted this. And since the rules of duels dictated that the person being challenged got to pick the weapon and location, Burlingame told Brooks to grab a rifle and meet at the U.S. Naval Yard on the Canadian side of Niagara Falls so they could get around the current U.S. ban on dueling. Brooks was actually very shocked that Burlingame enthusiastically accepted, and he was very aware of Burlingame's advanced marksmanship abilities. So Brooks, being the giant pussy that he was, failed to show up for the duel and cited various vague risks to his safety by having to travel through hostile northern territories with the liberals up there. Although a motion to expel Brooks from Congress failed, he ended up resigning on his own on July 15th. He did, however, make sure to let everyone know that he had no intention of actually killing Sumner, even though he nearly did in this fight, and that he would have used a different weapon to do so if that was his plan. Brooks was then tried for assault. He was convicted and fined $300. This kid is killing me. Because the South enjoys being racist, Brooks was then reelected on August 1st following a special election and won a new term following the general elections later that November. However, Brooks ended up dying from croup 2 months later on January 27th, 1857. In honor of Brooks and his attack on Senator Sumner, the town of Melendez, Florida actually changed its name to Brooksville, which it still is today. That story is over. We're done. We're done with that story. Can I move on to the next one? Well, we're going to try. All right. We're on to the early 1940s now, while most men were off during World War II. A guy named Paul Cantrell ran for sheriff in McMinn County in eastern Tennessee. Cantrell used his rich upbringing to possibly dodge the draft. He also then used it to influence elections and then swap sheriff and state senate seats with his own deputy, Pat Mansfield, for 2 entire election cycles. Cantrell became actually so power hungry that he paid his deputies based on how many people they would arrest each month. For a 10-year period between 1936 and 1946, McMinn County deputies collected almost $300,000 from tourists and residents on random crimes that most people weren't even guilty of. When the war ended, nearly 3,000 veterans, which was almost 10% of the county's population, returned home and were immediately arrested for no real reason. This group of veterans, led by Bill White, decided that Cantrell's corruption was going to end at that point and formed their own nonpartisan group called the GI Nonpartisan League to overthrow Cantrell and Mansfield's political system. So Mansfield, upon learning about this new veterans group, hired 200 new deputies, most living in other counties and states, and actually paid them $50 per day, which is pretty steep for a police. I don't even think police officers make $50 a day now. They probably do. That's kind of an exaggeration. Basically, police officers don't get paid a ton. When the polls for the new sheriff election cycle opened on August 1st, 1946, Mansfield stationed his new armed deputies at various polling places around the county. When Tom Gillespie, an elderly black farmer, was prevented from voting at the Athens Waterworks polling place, a poll watcher on the side of the veterans objected to the blatant racism. In response, Patrolman C.M. Wise punched this old black man in the face with a pair of brass knuckles. Gillespie then tried to run away, but was shot in the back and killed by this patrolman. Sheriff Mansfield heard about the incident, and he arrived at the polling place a short time later and closed the polls early. He then tried to arrest the two GI poll watchers, Charles Scott and Ed Vestal, for attempting to tamper with the votes, which they weren't doing at all. When Neil Esminger from the local paper showed up to get a vote count, Scott and Vestal used him as a distraction, jumped through a plate glass window, and fled among a shower of gunfire from Mansfield's other armed deputies. In the middle of this shootout, 3 officers confiscated the ballot box and took it over to the local jail. At this point, someone in the crowd shouted, "Let's go get our guns!" And that obviously overjoyed the crowd of voters as they marched down to S&K George to retrieve their arsenal of weapons that they had been stockpiling S&K Garage. I don't know why I said George. I thought it was the name of a dude. No, they marched down to S&K Garage to retrieve their arsenal of weapons that they had been stockpiling for this very moment. They wanted to fight again. Because look, I mean, a lot of these people, they're addicted to war at this point. And so they just want any reason to start shooting. So the crowd then grabs 7 of Mansfield's duties, disarms them, and takes them back to the garage. So after this army, this crowd of people who just want to fight somebody had gotten their weapons and gone back to the town of Athens, the remaining veterans then took the deputies they had captured to a patch of woods about 10 miles outside of town, where they stripped them naked, tied them to a tree, and began beating them. Meanwhile, while this was going on at the 12th Precinct in Athens, GIs Bob Harrell and Leslie Dooley watched as a Mansfield lackey named Minus Wilburn actually allowed a girl who clearly was not old enough to vote to literally stuff the ballot box with votes for Mansfield. I know, it's crazy, right? And so this kid, he's just the least interested in recording this episode ever. When Harrell confronted Wilburn about it, he was slapped with a leather strap and kicked in the face. Wilburn then closed the polling place and took the ballot box with all of the stuffed ballots back to the jail. By now, Bill White, who, had organized this entire protest movement in the first place, he'd had enough. All right. So he ordered 6 men to go down and break into the National Guard armory to steal as many weapons as possible. And within minutes, the GIs had taken 60 30-06 Enfield rifles and 2 Thompson submachine guns, which White then distributed along with the ammo to a group of 60 GIs. So when all of the rest of the polls closed that day, early returns indicated that despite everything that Mansfield had done, the GIs somehow had a 3-to-1 ratio lead. Again, despite all of the rigging. However, that did not yet account for the ballot boxes that had been taken to the jailhouse by Mansfield's lackeys. The GIs realized they had to get those stolen boxes to make sure that they had won and that Mansfield's men wouldn't further tamper with the ballots. White knew that technically his group had already broken several laws and that reinforcements from the governor would arrive in the morning to take them out. So he had to act fast. By 9 o'clock that night, White's men had taken a position inside of a bank across from the jailhouse, while Mansfield's men were inside the jail counting the stolen ballots. Another group of GIs then positioned themselves on a hill near the post office. So they're in this standoff, and, White's just like, "Will you damn bastards bring those damn ballot boxes out here, or we're going to set siege against the jail and blow it down." That's a direct quote from him. He probably sounded like that. Mansfield's 55 deputies guarding the jail literally laughed at White's demands and refused. And then within seconds, White's men just opened fire on the jailhouse. And for the next several hours, the GIs and Mansfield's deputies fired thousands of rounds at each other in downtown's Athens, Tennessee. Those who didn't have guns just fist fought each other in the street with their bare hands. Others threw Molotov cocktails at the jailhouse. But all of that was not enough. White then ordered his men to toss dynamite at the jailhouse, but apparently no one had the ability to throw the sticks that far. And so instead, the dynamite began landing on the street and blowing up every car, including Mansfield's, that was parked in front of the jailhouse, which is funny to me. By 3:30 a.m., the deputies finally surrendered after one of White's dynamite charges blew a hole in the side of the jailhouse wall. White's men then entered the jailhouse and retrieved the ballot boxes, which had clearly been doctored in Mansfield's favor. When the official votes were finally counted, Henry Knox, the GI's candidate for sheriff, was declared the winner. And then, because these GIs were respectable, good old Southern military veterans, they cleaned all of the rifles they had stolen and returned them to the armory the next morning. They even repaired the jailhouse wall that they had blown up. White was then made a sheriff's deputy, and none of his men were ever tried for crimes relating to the revolt and destruction of downtown Athens. Two more stories here. These are pretty short. Town of Hurricane, West Virginia is the home of Jack Fellure, who desperately wants to be president of the United States and turn the country back into a nation that actually never existed. He began his first presidential campaign in 1988 as a Republican running against George H.W. Bush. His platform was the authorized King James Bible. Not like a list of ideas and plans, just the whole book and everything in it. Just whatever the Bible says is how we're going to govern this country. So women, watch out. When people understandably asked for more specifics on what his plans for the presidency were, Fellure said that he'd get rid of all alcohol, abortion, and pornography. He would make prayer in schools mandatory and homosexuality illegal. He then blamed all of America's problems on, quote, atheists, Marxists, liberals, queers, liars, draft dodgers, flag burners, dope addicts, sex perverts, and anti-Christians. And this is 1988, which... amazing how that sounds like something you would hear today. The American people obviously were not impressed, and Fellure didn't even make it on the ballot. I love that his last name is Fellure. Like, it's not like it's spelled Fellure, which I assume is failure. Maybe it's Fellure. It's Fellure because he's a failure. Hey, whoop, whop. Anyway, 4 years later in 1992, Fellure ran against Bush again and spent $40,000 of his own money to appear on ballots in New Hampshire, West Virginia, and Kansas. How does this guy have just $40,000 in 1992 money laying around? That's wild to me. When the Federal Election Commission asked for a copy of his platform, he sent them a copy of the Bible. Shockingly, he actually received 36 votes in New Hampshire, which is crazy. Fellure then ran for the Republican nomination again in 1996 against Bob Dole. However, he continued criticizing Bush by saying the former president had, quote, continued to water the seeds of international satanic Marxism, which I'm pretty sure doesn't actually mean anything. He then claimed that Dole's opponent, Bill Clinton, had, quote, shifted into overdrive the socialistic Marxist New World Order agenda, which definitely does not actually mean anything. And also is crazy how that still sounds like something you would hear today. And this is like almost 30 years ago. Fellure then ran for president as a Republican in the next three elections, but didn't pick up any votes. I can't imagine why. In 2012, he realized that he probably wasn't going to win the presidency as a Republican, so he joined the Prohibition Party, which is actually the third oldest party, or the oldest third party in America, and won their candidacy, which is wild, probably because they didn't have anybody else running. He actually, in the 2012 election, received 518 votes, which is a personal best for him. But he quit the Prohibition Party and rejoined the Republicans, where he filed to run in the 2016 and 2020 elections. He's probably running again, as this is recorded. Can't imagine his platform is any different, and he's still just a maniac. Our final story here happened in 2006, where, as things tended to go in Africa, a coalition government took control of the Democratic Republic of Congo. One part of the coalition's agreement was that a small group known as the UNAFEC, the UNIFEC, was able to submit their candidates for trade minister, which is apparently an important seat in the Congo. UNIFEC leader Kisimba Ngoy wanted to be the trade minister, but thanks to a poor relationship with Congo's Prime Minister Antoine Gizenga, Ngoy knew that he had little chance of actually winning this seat. However, he did not want anyone else to be the trade minister, so he submitted 2 nominations for the seat. He submitted himself and 34-year-old Kasongo Ilunga, who wasn't even a real person. Shockingly, this is just how things go in Africa. Prime Minister Gizenga hated Kisimba Ngoy so much that he just chose Kasongo Ilunga for the seat without even checking to see if Ilunga was a real person, because he wasn't. And when Ilunga was announced as the new trade minister, Ngoy panicked and wrote up a fake resignation letter from the fake new trade minister, alleging that Ilunga's quote-unquote resignation was for personal reasons. Ngoy was then doubly shocked when Gizenga refused to accept the resignation letter, the fake resignation letter from the fake person, and insisted that Ilunga resign from the position in person. Even worse, several people with the actual name Kasongo Ilunga began showing up at the trade ministry to try to claim the open seat, because apparently that name is basically the Congolese equivalent of John Smith. So, this dude's such an idiot. And I love that this plan backfired on him completely. You know, it's like if the president, it's literally like if the president was appointing a new Supreme Court justice and he sends 2 names to Congress, and Congress is just so against this president that they throw out the name of the real person and they just automatically appoint the name of this fake person that they've never even met. And then the president's got to panic and it's like, John Smith, he resigned. And then all of these John Smiths come out of the woodwork because it's a super common name. And they're like, no, I'm the real, whatever. And it's just crazy. In each instance, Ngoy had to officially deny that each Kasongo Ilunga trying to claim the cabinet seat was not the same Kasongo Ilunga that he had nominated. It quickly became obvious that Ngoy's phantom minister was a scam, and UNIFEC officials officially expelled him from their party. In response, Ngoy doubled down on this and claimed that he was the one who was expelling party members from UNIFEC, but no one took him seriously and his political career was over. All right, some pathetic politics in the books. Sorry if that episode or today's episode was very choppy and all over the place. There was a baby who was not cooperating, and I have since ejected him from the studio, and he is now in his crib where he's not taking a nap because he's being a bad baby. Anyway, let's see what we learned today.
What did we learn?
Number 1, Preston Brooks beat the hell out of another congressman. And this was in the 1850s. So you think Congress can't get along today? They literally used to beat each other up. Number 2, the town of Athens, Tennessee was run by a really corrupt sheriff. And then some people took a stand against it and literally turned the town into a war zone over it. Number 3, Jack Fellure, ran for president a lot. No one really took him seriously and hardly ever got votes. He last ran in 2020, and breaking news, on July 31st, 2022, Fellure died in Huntington, West Virginia at the age of 90. So just unfortunate that he's not going to be in this upcoming election. Next week on Our Weird World, we are kicking off season 5 with just an assortment of weirdos. 3 stories of just 3 weird people. To be honest, I don't remember what they're about. And this kid is a ticking time bomb of crying. So I've got to wrap this up really quick. But we're looking at the stories of John Burgess, Terry Thompson, and Richard Snell. And he's about to throw up on me. So that's it. Thank you so much for listening. Tell all your friends, keep it weird. Bye.